Hello and welcome. Thank you all very much for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. My name is Diarmuid Torney. I am Chair of Future Earth Ireland and an Associate Professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. Future Earth is a global network of scientists, researchers and innovators that aims to provide the knowledge needed to support transformations towards sustainability. Future Earth Ireland, convened by the Royal Irish Academy, is the National Committee of Future Earth and is composed of members from a diverse range of academic disciplines, as well as from industry and policymaking. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 3 webinars co-hosted by Future Earth Ireland, focusing on the theme, how can higher education build forward better? Across these 3 webinars this spring, we aim to explore how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our perception of what changes in society are feasible and what this radically changed landscape means for how higher education institutions on the island of Ireland and beyond can contribute to the transition to a sustainable future. Today, we are focusing on research and innovation. The second and third webinars in this series will focus on engagement with society on the 23rd of March and on teaching and learning on the 28th of April. Details of these further 2 webinars will be publicised in due course. We hope that the insights from today's webinar and from the other 2 webinars in this series will contribute also to the ongoing work of the Higher Education Futures Task Force. This task force has been convened by the Royal Irish Academy to explore framework options for the future development of higher education across the island of Ireland. We in Future Earth Ireland are very grateful to the UCD Earth Institute for co-hosting today's webinar. Its director, Professor Tasman is a member of the Future Earth Ireland Committee and will be chairing today's webinar. Thank you also to Katrina Devery and Will Fitzmaurice of the UCD Earth Institute and Jennifer Keneally of the Royal Irish Academy for their work to organise today's webinar. Finally, if you are tweeting about this afternoon's webinar, please use the hashtag #HEBuildForwardBetter. With that, I'd like to welcome you again and hand over to our chair for today, Professor Tasman Crowe, Director of the UCD Earth Institute.
Great, thanks very much, Diarmuid, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this first webinar in the Build Forward Better series. As Diarmuid said, my name is Tasman Crowe, and I'm the Director of the UCD Earth Institute, and we're co-hosting this webinar with Future Earth Ireland. In today's webinar, focused on research and innovation, we're going to be discussing what higher education can do in terms of research and innovation to contribute to a more sustainable post-COVID future, and how we can maximise that contribution by fostering an interdisciplinary research ecosystem that engages researchers with policy, enterprise and wider society. I'd like to start by welcoming our panel members and thanking them very much indeed for joining us. So welcome to Anna Viseu, who's joining us from Lisbon and brings a broad perspective in interdisciplinary approaches to addressing sustainability challenges. To Linda Doyle from Trinity College Dublin, until recently its Dean of Research and now one of 3 candidates to be its Provost for the next 10 years. To Brian O'Gallagher, who is Director of myriad, the interdisciplinary interinstitutional SFI Research Centre on Energy, Climate and the Marine, and he's based at University College Cork. To Olga Grant, who provides a policy perspective from the Office of Government Procurement, and Tom Flanagan of Nova UCD, who works in the innovation space and has really extensive experience of the interface between third level and enterprise. I'm going to start by asking each panelist in turn to speak in response to a particular broad question related to their own experience of third level research and innovation and its impact. Then we'll have a wider panel discussion before opening up to questions from the audience. And when the time comes, please relay your questions to us via the chat function rather than the Q&A. And please use it only for questions and comments directly related to the discussion. Thank you. So I'd like to start by introducing Associate Professor Anna Viseu, who is from IADE, the Faculty of Design, Technology and Communication at Universidade Europea, and a member of the Centro Interuniversitario de Historia de Ciencias e Tecnologia, Universidade de Lisboa. Her research is rooted in sociocultural aspects of technoscience and feminist technoscience, and she specializes in ethnographic studies of the cultures of development. She's also interested in issues of politics and power, and in 2019, she was one of 100 Portuguese female scientists honored by Ciência Viva. Anna, could you comment for us, please, on how cross-disciplinary collaboration can be fostered, particularly between STEM and AHSS, Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences disciplines, and why it's important to do so in the context of sustainability?
So, first I want to thank you for inviting me to be here today and for your fantastic Portuguese. You did extremely well reading all the names of these research centers where I belong. And I should start by saying that preparing for this event has been both challenging and productive. It has kind of forced me to re-examine my thinking and my practices, and also to do so in 5 minutes. And so I'm going to do my best to give a cohesive answer, because the issue of sustainability, and without wanting to be a cliche or to sound like a startup company, the issue of building a better world is an issue that concerns me deeply. And so my contribution today will be crafted around 2 axes. The first revolves around my research into scientific governance and the politics and policies of interdisciplinarity. And the second will be based on my practices as a professor. I start with the former. In the past 15 to 20 years, policymakers all over the world have started to insist on cross-disciplinary collaboration and interdisciplinarity as a solution to social problems. In many countries, this was engraved in legislation and is then enacted by funding agencies, thus ensuring compliance from the academic and scientific community. But as much as politicians and policymakers laud the value of interdisciplinarity, we are still looking for models to properly enact and evaluate it, just as much as we are still in need of a better understanding of the contributions that the social sciences can actually make. Society is often conjured in political speeches as being in trouble, but more often than not, this is accompanied by imaginaries of the future where solutions rest on the power of science and technology. Such visions matter because they contain deep asymmetries between the roles of STEM and the social sciences in the creation of a sustainable, better world. These asymmetries are then replicated and ingrained in funding calls and funding schemes. And so my first suggestion is that we need to assume and confront these asymmetries head on. This should be done by providing more equitable funding for all disciplines, but this is the really obvious part. I believe it should also be accompanied by a recognition of the different added value that each brings to the table. Too often, funding agencies mistake consensus for success. In doing so, they force us all to speak with one voice, thus losing the specific contributions that our distinct expertises enable us to bring to the table. And so this is my second suggestion, that we acknowledge difference and dissent, that we make it visible, that we value it as a valid result of cross-disciplinary collaboration. Let me now turn to the second axis, my role as an educator and how I deal with these issues in the classroom. I teach students from the social sciences, from the arts, and from STEM alike. And I invariably start the term by telling them that the world is not a given. Our reality is not natural. It is, sorry, it is instead the product of choices that are made by politicians, by policymakers, increasingly by CEOs, but also by designers and engineers like themselves. The products they create can work to reify, transform, or even subvert the given order of things. I tell them that they will be making plenty of choices and that choosing by nature excludes. It excludes possibilities, it excludes people, and sometimes it excludes change. I teach them that their responsibility is great and that before asking, they should always ask themselves a question that is at the core of feminist technoscience, which is, how could it be otherwise? What other worlds can we create? Thank you. I don't know if that was more than 5 minutes. I hope not.
No, that was perfect. Thank you very much, Anna. Really interesting perspective. So next, I'm going to introduce Professor Linda Doyle, who is Professor of Engineering and the Arts in the School of Computer Science and Statistics at Trinity College Dublin. No need for any Portuguese this time. Linda's expertise is in the fields of wireless communications, cognitive radio, reconfigurable networks, spectrum management, and creative arts practices. And she's just finished a term as the Dean of Research at Trinity and is the founder director of Connect, a national research centre on future networks and communications. It's been co-funded by Science Foundation Ireland and industry. She's a member of Ireland's National Broadband Steering Committee. She chairs the Ofcom Spectrum Advisory Board in the UK and is a member of the Open Research Europe Scientific Advisory Board. So thanks for joining us, Linda. And if you were the leader of an Irish university, how would you set about integrating research and fostering innovation in relation to sustainability?
Well, thank you very much, Tasman, for inviting me onto this very, very interesting panel. And maybe I'll just start by saying, I think there is a load of fantastic work, including by people on this panel, that does that kind of integration and takes that integrative approach to research. But if I'm answering in the context of a university, for me, I'd like to just make 4 points during this brief chat. And the first, to a certain extent, carries on a little bit from what Anna says. So the first point I think we need to do is we need to frame the work appropriately. And I say this because I suppose part of me is reacting like a systems engineer and thinking of the whole system. But I say this because when you look at the challenges we face now, whether you look at the biodiversity issues, the climate change issues, or the human part, they all push on each other. So very often when we make advances in terms of climate change and technology-wise, there's biodiversity impacts. And we all know from a climate justice perspective, there can be human impacts as well. So from my perspective, any research that's centered in this space needs to properly recognize that wider framing and the fact that there's this kind of larger system in which we sit. And when you push on one thing, you can also have consequences elsewhere. And if you look at how we do research, you know, and even in my own background, when I looked at telecommunication systems, I wouldn't have come from a world where you would look at that in that kind of wider context. And for me, one of the key ways forward is that framing. Now, there's a second part to the framing that I think is very important, and that's possibly what you could call the economic framing. And I bring this in the context of the word innovation. So we're talking about research and innovation here. And I think that if we frame things economically as we have been doing up to now, there will be no building back better or building back fairer or no kind of green revolution. So I just want to throw 2 things on the table. I don't necessarily agree with this framing, but 2 kinds of economic framing. So I was looking at the World Economic Forum, and one of the things they talk about there is the Great Reset. And in that, they introduced this notion of stakeholder capitalism. And in that framing, it's framed that private corporations kind of are the guardians or trustees of society. And through making, I suppose, private corporations more environmental, social, and governance, I suppose, aware in terms of whether it's human rights or the environment, or et cetera, the kind of belief through that framing is that then will have a knock-on effect for society. An alternative economic framing that I'm also interested in is one that comes out of the kind of donut economics and Kate Rawhart's kind of framing. And in her case, she talks about this kind of donut where we all work within a bottom layer of social responsibility and an upper layer of an ecological ceiling. And we need to not push beyond the ecological signaling or below the social kind of responsibility. And she talks moving away from goals like GDP, again, seeing this big picture and designing to redistribute. And from my perspective, and just in terms of my own kind of view, the latter one is more a framing that I prefer. And I'm not by any means suggesting any one framing is right. But what I am saying is when we frame the research and innovation that we do in a university, we need to do it from a new perspective. And we need to think of these different ways of kind of, I suppose, setting the landscape for the work. And I think unless we do that, we're not going to get to this build back better kind of space that we're looking for, whichever your preference might be. We may need to not acknowledge multiple framings as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think we need to do to integrate it better is to push on open doors. And by that, I see there is a lot of voices that are clamoring to be involved in this, not least of which are our students, who I think come with a much more demanding request for the speed at which we move forward. And I also think there are companies and other institutions like your own and others around Ireland that kind of you're pushing on open doors and kind of working together. Following that, I think we need to then work on the rest. So the third step for us, after we frame, after we push on the open doors, for me would be very much about inviting in, you know, and kind of persuading the wider bit, the wider population. And then finally, and I think this is very, very challenging, we need to lead by example. And one of the things that we do in universities very often, I feel, is we're very creative and have fantastic research outputs and all sorts of great ideas, but we don't necessarily live by those. And I think it's quite challenging in terms of you know, how a university runs, how academic and research life is run. And whether you're talking about green labs, whether you're talking about the travel that you do for research, whether you're talking about any of those things, you need to also kind of reflect on those in the wider system. So for me, taking an integrative approach is that framing, that pushing on open doors, that bringing along the rest, and living, I suppose, walking the walk and leading by example. So there are my comments.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Linda. Next, I'd like to invite Professor Brian O'Gallagher to comment. He is the Professor of Energy Engineering at University College Cork and Director of MARI, the SFI Research Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine. He leads MARI's research on energy systems modelling and scenario analysis, and that has underpinned Irish and EU energy and climate mitigation policies and energy company strategies. And he's received the SFI Best International Engagement Award in 2020. Brian's also the elected chair of the International Energy Agency Technology Collaboration Programme on Energy Systems Modelling and is an elected fellow of the Irish Academy of Engineering. Brian, I'd like to ask, can you comment on how research activity can be better integrated across institutions to address the climate and biodiversity emergencies?
Thank you, Taz. I'm delighted to be here. Can you see my screen? Great.
Yep.
So I've zoomed in on the word here, institutions, and I wanted to make 4 points. One is how we integrate research into our own institution here, as in University College Cork, to address the emergencies. I also want to talk about how we collaborate with other institutions. In this case, I'm going to pick a few examples from companies and help them address the emergency. The third element is about researching social institutions themselves in their ability to address the emergency. And then finally, I'll talk about a new cross-institutional network that was set up to actually look at leveraging research to address the emergencies. So the focus here will be on institutions. So firstly, if we look at UCC, 10 years ago, we were the first university in the world to receive a green flag. And research was a very important part of informing what we do. But there were 3 dimensions to what we've been doing. Student-led, which is a very important part of our activities in UCC. And this is for the university itself, if you like, to reduce its carbon footprint. And as you can see from the list of things coming up, it was very much practice focused. So it's not research in isolation, but research that's responding to a demand from students and has a focus on change that's delivered through how we do things. And I won't go into the detail of those specific things, but you can see there's a wide-ranging changes that we've instigated over the last 10 years. So that's one example of research informing our own institution. If we look at how we've integrated research through collaboration with companies, the first picture here of the wind turbine is from a pharmaceutical plant down in Ringaskiddy. And some of our researchers supported the company, firstly, to reduce its carbon footprint by reducing its energy bill. So using intelligent energy efficiency to make sure that every kilowatt hour that was used effectively. And then the company wanted to go a step further, so we supported them in planning how to integrate wind-generated electricity into their energy mix, so further reducing their carbon footprint. We've worked with the Business in the Community Ireland group to assist them in their discussions around how to get companies to make these low carbon pledges, which started with a reduction in carbon intensity and has now moved on, if you like, to actual emissions reductions and looking at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 emission reductions. And the final one is Irish Distillers. We've been working with them on how to make a zero emissions whiskey, which has been fascinating, and I can't wait to taste it. The next item I wanted to talk about is research on institutions themselves. So we've set up this wonderful collaborative project. I saw John Barry in the chat there, and he's one of our collaborative researchers working on this project. And here we're looking to develop a model of deep institutional innovation in order to enable flourishing of sustainability and human development. And by institutions here, we can see in parentheses what we mean. It's social institutions, so politics as an institution, economics, technology, religion, gender and care, and higher education. And then finally, we've been working over this last year with yourself, Taz, and others to establish an all-island climate and biodiversity research network. So this is effectively networking the climate and biodiversity researchers on the island of Ireland to see how we can best leverage that research to address the emergencies. So different examples there of how research has informed institutional change, how we're doing research on institutional innovation, and how we're collating or bringing together the institutions involved in research to work to address collectively the emergency. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, Taz.
Thanks very much, Brian. Brian, that's great. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Orla Grant, who has a bachelor's degree in environmental science and a PhD in plant biology, which she followed by 14 years of fundamental and applied research in public and private research institutes and universities in Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and the UK. She's gained further experience in research management in science and engineering before joining the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications, where she worked in environmental policy and climate adaptation policy. Olga recently moved to the Office of Government Procurement, where her main focus is the inclusion of environmental and social considerations in public procurement. And so Olga is someone who has experience of both academia and policymaking. How well equipped do you think the Irish policymaking system is to absorb research insights from academia? And kind of conversely, how do you think knowledge transfer can be enhanced in a post-COVID world to translate evidence bases into solutions and policy?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and in this company today. So I'd say in answer to the first part of your question, I think in this particular area of sustainability, the Irish policymaking system is already quite well equipped to take on board research insights from academia. And that's because there have been links and a close relationship between policymaking and research in the area of sustainability going back decades now. So for example, since 1994, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, has funded research that provides essential scientific support for environmental policy development, implementation and broader decision making. And many officials in the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications, where, as you mentioned, I worked until recently, are involved in suggesting topics for inclusion in annual EPA research calls. And then they input into the longer term research strategy of the EPA as well. And they are involved in reviewing project proposals in relevant areas from a policy perspective. And then they sit in steering committees of EPA funded research projects. So I sat in several when I was in that department. This means that the officials are seeing the implications of research for policy as that research develops. And then they can incorporate that knowledge into policy making. And I'd also mention that several key policy documents in the sustainability area highlight the need for research to address gaps in knowledge. So I think that gives a good indication of how it is understood amongst policymakers that research is needed. So just a couple of examples, one that I'm very familiar with is the National Adaptation Framework. And that actually, this is about building resilience to the changing climate in Ireland. And it actually states that the research carried out to date has been hugely instrumental, it uses those words, in developing the current knowledge base on impacts, risks and vulnerabilities to climate change, with a view to informing climate change adaptation decision making. And as another example, a waste action plan for circular economy, which was launched in September last year, includes an entire chapter on research and innovation. And this acknowledges the critical importance of advancing knowledge in relevant areas. And one of the measures included in the plan is to work with the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science on the Successor Strategy to Innovation 2020 to ensure it supports research that provides the evidence base for informed policy making. So I've only time for a couple of examples, but I really do believe there is already capacity and appetite amongst policymakers to take on board insight from researchers, and this is something that we can build on to build forward better. So turning to the second part of your question, regarding the post-COVID world, well, I think firstly we need to look at what has actually changed during the pandemic. And it seems, and there might be others involved who have more information on this, but it seems that there might be a greater public understanding of the role of research in determining policy, at least in the health area, as a result of seeing modelers involved in the process that leads to decision making on public health. Also, there may be an increase in interest amongst the public in nature. We seem to be seeing a greater appreciation of local green and blue spaces, and maybe also there's greater awareness of how our behaviour can impact on our environment. So like we all saw news reports about improved air quality during the first lockdown, for example. We've seen rapid innovation in certain areas relevant to sustainability in response to the pandemic, particularly in relation to mobility and e-working. And then the EU had already launched its Green Deal before the pandemic, but the Recovery and Resilience Facility in response to the pandemic really moves a lot further. So to obtain grants or loans under this programme, member states must ensure their recovery plans contribute to environmental sustainability. And additionally, the UN has highlighted the impact of habitat destruction and potentially also climate change in increasing the risk of transfer of pathogens to human populations. So there's a lot has happened during the pandemic that may be increasing understanding of the role of research, of the role of nature and the role of sustainability, and emphasising and maybe shifting the emphasis within the sustainability areas as well. So I do think that now is a good time for sustainability researchers to explain the role of their research to the public in terms of how it's used by policymakers and how it can protect the nature and the environmental quality that people have perhaps become to appreciate more. The need for rapid innovation in certain areas means there's potential for an increase in engagement between policy and research for those certain strategic areas. Increased emphasis in EU and UN policy making on sustainability, I think that can only be a good thing for research in the area of sustainability, but researchers should be prepared for a potential shift in emphasis on some sustainability areas over others. And just as ideally policymakers should be following research and keeping abreast of developing research, researchers should also follow seat developments in EU and UN policy and be ready for a shift in emphasis. I think there have been developments lately that are very positive. We might get into that in the later section in relation to collaboration between research and policy. But there probably still is room for more initiatives that could perhaps explain some aspects of research to policymakers better, and perhaps vice versa as well.
That's great. Thanks very much, Olga. Really nice insights. I'd like to finish then in this first round of questions and answers with Tom Flanagan, who's the Director of Enterprise and Commercialization in Innova UCD at University College Dublin. Innova UCD has supported over 375 entrepreneurs to attract over 775 million euros in investments and create thousands of jobs. He's recently secured 4 million euros to develop an AgTech Innovation Centre for entrepreneurs at UCD's Lions Farm in Selbridge. And Tom is on the EIF-funded Atlantic Bridge University Fund, supporting investments in innovative startups from university research in Ireland. He's previously served on the founding boards of several high-tech startup companies, including Decawave, which was acquired for over 360 million euros last year. And he served on the board of the Dublin City Local Enterprise Office, setting strategy and approving grants and investments in over 200 innovative startups. So Tom, with that kind of perspective and experience, how do you think that the higher education industry partnerships can be enhanced in a post-COVID world to support innovation and economic and societal impact of the kind we've just been talking about?
Thanks very much, Taz. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. When we think about a post-COVID world, I think what we can recognize is that it is one world. And I think we've seen the one world aspect in terms of how small the world is and how quickly a small virus can have a huge impact in everybody's life all the way around the world. I think we've all also seen huge opportunity to adapt fast. We have proven ourselves to be quite adaptive, very quick to make changes that have had significant impact on ourselves and on industry. And I think as well, we've recognized the importance of science. You know, if you don't have the science right, all the policy making in the world won't get you there. So I think they're the key things that I've certainly learned from the COVID and what I think will go into a post-COVID world. In terms of HEI and industry partnerships, I think what we need to do in the academic environment is recognize the societal and regulatory constraints and requirements that are putting pressure on companies to innovate with impact. And to frame that discussion, you know, you think about the things that are happening. So, you know, the Green Deal has been mentioned, the amount of regulation that's coming in place now, this year, next year, and so on, is enormous, and it'll have a huge impact on industry and how industry operates. So you have everything from the Green Deal, biodiversity strategy, the EU taxonomy, defining what it means to be green, all the way through to energy lending policies that define where the European Investment Bank can invest. So structuring investments towards green economy activities. And then I begin to look at the investments that happen as well. So there's public sentiment that creates the need and the desire within organizations to think about impact investments. So how do you invest in a way that's consistent with your theology, that, you know, you want a greener planet? And so there are, you know, there's opportunities to do that. There's various venture funds that are coming about. Wake Up Capital is one. The Yield Lab has 100 million to invest in AgTech opportunities, and their focus is on solutions for a healthier, more sustainable future. I think as well, you'll see that the pensions and the foundations and various investors that invest in companies will be looking for the credentials, the green credentials. And so a number of companies are already looking as to what they need to do to get certified as B corporations and get that certification to show that they're moving in the right direction. So that's the investment and the regulatory. The other aspect, I suppose, is the cost of doing business. So with regulation comes a cost. And so the carbon tax creates a need to offset that, and either through some kind of decarbonization plan. And if you look at a company, for example, Terios in France, they do sugar production, and they would fall under the EU ETS guidelines, and they have invested in a 200 million euro investment plan in decarbonization. So they're doing the usual things, moving from coal to gas. They're doing biogas production from byproducts. They're looking at heat recovery, but they've also put a call out, an innovation call out to their community, to the community of entrepreneurs, to see what other innovations are out there that they could support, add value to, or become clients of, or invest in. And those kind of innovation calls, that's something new that is very attractive. And I think you'll see more of that, where people recognize the problem and put a reach out to industry, as well as to academia, to support them in finding solutions. I think as well, if you are focused on your ESG strategy, you'll be looking at your supply chain, you'll be looking upstream, you'll be looking downstream, and you'll be looking for connectivity in that, and you'll be forcing others to also be thinking about sustainability and thinking about not just the internal rate of return for your own corporation, but also the external rate of return. What's the real cost of your operation, and what's the impact that it has on the environment? I think as well, we're facing into a time when, you know, you're hiring Generation Z, and they are looking at, you know, how green is your company? How sustainable is your company? Are you doing good in the world? And that'll have a change. And then I think finally, public sentiment has a huge impact to play in the adoption of technology. So there's a lot of concern, a lot of engagement around wind farms, around robotics, around artificial intelligence. And society has a role to play in the adoption of those and the acceptance of those. And I think from an academia perspective, there's opportunity not just for the STEM folks to be involved in this, but also for the social science folks to be involved in ensuring that as we put forward technologies and as we become more innovative and create solutions to these problems, that they're holistic solutions. And I leave it there.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that broader perspective is so important. So we're going to, after those kind of initial perspectives, we're going to proceed into a sort of more short format panel discussion with a series of questions for the panelists. So starting kind of following on from that thread, I guess. So the first question is how has our understanding of sustainability research and innovation been altered by the COVID-19 pandemic, and what new research agendas have been opened up in your view? I might start with Linda, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that question.
Yeah, thanks, Tasman. So, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is maybe that our understanding of research has changed fairly significantly by the pandemic. And I think I would go as far to say that the wider public have a greater understanding of what research is, and has a greater understanding of maybe that things aren't all that black and white, and that there's multiple voices in it, and maybe a greater understanding of where research stops and politics starts. And I think all this will help in the context of understanding sustainability and sustainability research for the future. I mean, I do think there's a couple of things cutting across. I would have said at the start of the pandemic, in the first few months of it, I felt around me a greater feeling or movement to build back better or build back fairer. And I think as time's going on, I certainly notice, and I suppose this is a bit of a negative thing to say, I certainly notice, you know, a focus now of just trying to get out of this. And I think there's an awful rush back to the real world that I think people will forget some of the things that at the beginning there was kind of this, you know, hope for a great new world, that we would come out of the pandemic better. So I see that diminishing a little bit, and I think there's a lot to push back on there that's really, really important. And maybe taking up something that Tom said, he was saying that there's an opportunity for the STEM people to work with social sciences and arts humanities, and I had actually pushed back on the word opportunity. I would say it's not an opportunity, it's an imperative. And essentially we have to move away from this is nice to have, that ultimately the only way we will move forward in this is by taking that full holistic view of biodiversity, climate change, the human factor, art, humanity, social science, STEM, all mixed in. And the final thing I would say on that is, sorry, so I think that opportunity needs to be held there. And oh yeah, the final thing I will say is that one of the other things that we've learned about research through the pandemic is that you can't actually prepare for, you can't strategize and have a top-down priority that's going to prepare you for everything that's going to come. And one of the big learnings for me is that the investment in the research system has paid off, even in areas that you didn't think were going to be useful at the time, because that investment led to a deep expertise that was able to adapt quickly, both in terms of turning turning our minds to the various aspects, the holistic aspects of COVID, as well as actually sharing infrastructure and resources. So for me, as I said, what I've learned is that I think we need to keep pushing for a better future, not take it as given it's just going to happen. That imperative to work across the disciplines is key, and certainly I think it's just really, really important that we come out of this, I suppose, very, very much focused on the fact that we need to work together even stronger.
Thanks very much, Linda. I might ask Anna to pick up that thread, and particularly the kind of social science humanities connection with science and engineering, and the new kind of opportunities that are appearing at that interface.
So I agree with what Linda said. I think but I'd say here, at least from my perspective and my side of the world, one of the things that has been put really in evidence from this pandemic is that a lot of the problems that have arisen are not technological nor scientific, but have to do with, poverty, with loneliness, with isolation, with lack of community ties. And what I see is the TV is full of experts. Those experts tend to come from, epidemiology, etc. And we need also to have a much better understanding and work on these social issues. And of course, I agree with what Tom and Linda said. STEM and the social sciences have to work together. Everyone agrees with that. The question is how, and we don't know how, because what tends to happen is that STEM leads the way, and social sciences, perhaps do some advising, but that's not social science. That's not all that we can offer. I was once talking to a scientist who was talking to me about, applying for grants with them. So I would apply for grants, as a partner in a STEM grant. And I said, fine, will you guys do the same for me? And they won't, right? It doesn't happen. And so, yes, of course we need to work together, but there is an inequality. And if there is one thing that this pandemic did, I agree with Linda, it showed that science is about uncertainty. It's about the multiplicity of things. But I kind of feel that we are putting too much faith in science and technology to solve problems that are not technological, are not scientific, they are social problems. We need investment there. For me, that has become really painfully obvious. That's it.
Thanks very much, Annie. And I noticed one of the questions focuses on the kind of its behavioural change is one of the biggest sort of steps towards addressing sustainability challenges. And that's a sort of social science and humanities perspective. So yeah. We might move on, and again, following through that sort of theme. So as you say, and I think it's evident that there are not as many opportunities as we might like for those kinds of partnerships to be funded on an equal basis. And so the next question is, what kinds of mechanisms do we need to co-create effective sustainability challenges? For example, between disciplines, but also with societal policy or industry partners. And I might go to Olga first for a comment on that one.
Thanks. Well, I think if we're focusing on outcomes more, and I suppose if research funding perhaps or research programs focused on outcomes rather than kind of being compartmentalized into, science funding and social science funding and so on, that could be very beneficial. And then the people would be looking at, well, where do we want to get as a society, and what disciplines do we need to get there? And it might not be disciplines, it might be, well, what partners do I need? And those might be industrial partners, they might be political partners, they might be government departments or agencies. And so that would be one approach that could help to provide the kinds of solutions that we need.
Absolutely, it's kind of mission-focused research.
Yeah.
To achieve an objective. Brian, do you have any thoughts on that and that process that you've obviously got some experience of as well?
I've loads of thoughts on it, Taz. In our research, we seek increasingly to co-create with partners outside of the academia, as well as I fully accept what Anna was saying about the challenges with STEM and social sciences collaborating and the power dynamic, and that's a real problem. But there's also a power dynamic between the academic institutions and the outside world. Not so much with industry partners, there's a well-developed kind of acceptance and kind of activity in that regard. But work we've been doing with citizens and communities, we find it's very difficult to get funding for the community part of it. So I mean, community development activity, which is key to really harnessing the opportunities of engaged research in when we're looking at sustainability within communities, that's a key challenge, and it's a funding gap. So that's something that can be addressed and should be addressed to address that deficiency. With the policymakers, our co-creation with policymakers, what we found works well there is secondments in both directions. So secondments from the policy system to academia, and from academia to the policy system. And also absorptive capacity. Olga made a good point about how the policy makers are engaged in kind of identifying research topics, and also on kind of panels, and we've benefited from that. But some of our work with the policy makers, it's very clear that they've very limited bandwidth to actually engage with research, and that's a key challenge. So looking at mechanisms where researchers and policy makers can come together, and some researchers will sort of stop at the point, well, I've published the article, it's policy relevant, they should just accept it and use it. And so we need to be better at communication and translating our research findings into policy insights, and the policy system needs to find more time and bandwidth to be able to engage with us. So there are some of the things I think that could be done.
Thanks very much. Tom, coming to you, do you see that there are currently kind of barriers that are making it difficult to get that engagement and co-creation between industry partners and academic researchers, and that could potentially be removed? Or do you see that it's already a thriving kind of relationship?
Yeah, I actually, in Ireland, I think it's a thriving relationship. I think there's been a lot of engagement. There's a lot of good systems in place. There's teams in place, knowledge transfer teams around the country in each of the universities working on smoothing the connections between industry and academia. And there's also templates, and there's a national IP protocol. So we have a lot of things already worked out. We're very capable of doing that. But I think in this context, it's not just about the industry academia engagement. It is about industry, academia, society, and policy, government policy. We need all four of those connected on any project, really. In fact, if you were to think about projects as we put them forward, the silo effect that we currently have in the EU and in Ireland as well, where we put out a call for proposals, we tend to focus them on solving the problem from a technical perspective and maybe even a commercial perspective as well. But we don't go the next steps along in terms of policy impact. And if we do put out a call for policy, it's just about policy. And there's not much thought around the economic impact or the economic opportunities, or maybe the technology. So I think broader calls that allow for all four aspects of problem solving to be brought together would be powerful. I think the other thing is calls that look for demonstrators. So there's obvious demonstration of new technologies and the impacts that they can have in those four different environments would be really valuable going forward.
Thanks, Tom. Linda.
I'm sorry for just trying to get in there. So I do think we know how to work very well with industry, as Tom said, in Ireland, but I think there's a huge challenge in this space. And mainly it's because if you really are pushing forward on the research, you want to wreck the industry business model that you want to work with. If you think of it like that, putting it in a black and white way. So if I pick out my own area of telecoms, okay, if you look at your mobile phone, you know, there's an enormous number of things in this mobile phone that are made from completely unsustainable materials that come from very poor supply chains, including, you know, conflict minerals that are involved in it. And if you were really to push back at that industry, it's not just about using we'll say, you know, low energy or new fuels, are designing, you know, routing protocols that are energy efficient. It's actually fundamentally questioning everything to do with the physical makeup of everything used, the communication systems we're now using to communicate, the supply chains behind them, how the communication systems sit on the landscape in that wider systematic biodiversity space, the data we use, which is hugely, you know, the surveillance capitalism that kind of drives things. And I think that's a big challenge. You want to work with industry, but you want to work in a way that's really disruptive. And I don't think we've overcome the barriers where there's enough. This is why I was talking about pushing open doors first and then moving on to onto others. But I don't think to a certain extent there's enough kind of, I suppose, courage to go beyond the business models that we have now, because it actually really asks you loads of really hard questions, if you know what I mean. So I think that's a very big barrier.
Can I respond to that? Because I just to be contrarian, I think there's a lot of startup companies that are more than happy to eat the bigger companies, and they'll be absolutely engaged. Now, the challenge, of course, there is that the funding models don't necessarily allow for startups to get engaged as well as you might like.
Absolutely.
And that's a challenge. All right, I agree with you on that.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to comment on possible barriers that may be holding us back in these engagements, and the agility that perhaps is needed to respond to emerging challenges? Anna.
So I'm a pessimist on these matters, perhaps because I spent many years working with engineers and scientists, and perhaps also because I work in a private university and have seen how this focus and emphasis on working with industry and shifting the university towards a much more kind of instrumental, outcome-based, deliverable-based focus hasn't worked well for disciplines like sociology or anthropology or, you know, the arts, things that take a very long time. You know, to do a study in anthropology, you need 2 years, and then you actually produce a book. And so you end up with no funding because that's not considered in any way important for policy, for action. And so I'm really wary of the ways in which we imagine these futures that focus on, you know, innovation and innovation. Yeah. So I mean, I am really a pessimist, and I realize I go against the great majority of the panel here, but I haven't seen much. I mean, obviously some things have improved, but as Linda mentioned, you know, surveillance capitalism, the ways in which corporations are now profiting from everything we do, the ways in which the social sciences and the arts are suffering now more than many other disciplines. The ways in which we are forced by funding agencies to produce more and more in terms of kind of RP, in terms of deliverables and tangible outcomes, that for me is detrimental for higher education as a whole. I don't see that we have the need, you can be an excellent professor and actually teach your students incredibly well, even if you don't work with industry, even if you don't innovate in any way, just helping them to think. I don't know. So I am a pessimist, I must say. I know this, and I'm usually, the only one. And I'm so happy you guys are much more optimistic than I am. But I see us going in the wrong direction in terms of how academia is moving. I don't see us improving as an ecosystem. Okay, so that's it.
So you're not alone in thinking like that. So I'm relying on Dermot Tawney, who's kindly kind of relaying a subset of the questions to me from the chat, and I've been flicking my eyes towards the questions coming in. There's lots of really interesting comments, but the first one that Dermot forwarded to me was phrased: would the panel agree that we have to accept that the current university model is part of the problem, not the solution to the planetary crisis? And a key part of this recognition is to see that the limits and multiple disbenefits of an economic conception of the university, including the reducing of innovation, business and technology. So I guess that chimes very closely with your view. Does anyone else have a response to that?
But let me just say one thing about, I think the universities are key to helping us get out of the place where we are. They are essential.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, universities were not meant to make money. They were not meant, they were meant to help us learn how to think. We've gone away, we've moved away from that in ways that, I find appalling. But so I would agree with the question. That's it.
Yeah, but not the first part of it.
Yeah. No, not the first part of it. No.
I have to stand up for universities a bit in that, I feel. But so one of the great things I think has happened in recent years is there's a much deeper understanding of what impact is. And I would argue ferociously that impact has moved away from a narrow understanding that it's a spin-out company or that it's something to do with industry. And there's actually an impact framework that people use now. And in Trinity, actually, we have an impact unit that's about actually understanding the wider remit of that. So I think, and if you look across the university, and I suppose Anna touched on this. I mean, I know, for example, over lockdown that, a whole load of people in Trinity who are interested in wetlands have gotten together in focusing on that. And there is incredible expertise that's really, really varied that I'm noticing much more now across multiple disciplines in business and in STEM, in arts, humanities and creative practices that all helps with this. So I suppose to echo what Anna said at the end, I think the ingredients exist in a university to act on this in the right way. I think impact is no longer narrow, which is a good thing. I do think the system in which we exist, I mean, I do believe in a public university and a properly funded public university. And I think it's incredibly important that that's maintained, because that independent voice is especially needed in this kind of a world where you can push back on various things, and that ability that I was talking about at the very beginning, where you kind of frame things and you understand that, if I take action with this technology, this is biodiversity implications, it is climate justice implications. That kind of joined up way of thinking, I think, is at the heart of what it means to be in a university. So I still would bring an optimism to it, even though I recognize we also have faults in the system that we have to self-examine and kind of root out.
Any other thoughts on that? I think that's a really good point, that we are changing the way that we think about what a university should be doing and assessing how well people are doing that. And there's still a road to travel, I guess, but we are moving in that direction.
Just to build on what Linda said there, there's impact case studies done in UCD as well, and I go along to them. I have mostly a commercial perspective, so I go along to them looking for the commercial opportunities. And we present 10 impact case studies every year, and I look at those, and there's maybe only 2 of them that have commercial potential. There's a lot of other impact that is equally valuable in terms of policy or societal impact that's recognized. And I think that is something, I think, like Linda says, we do have the right ingredients to do something right. And I do think that it's the cross-disciplinary, it's the creating the opportunities for people from multiple disciplines, including, looking at the societal impact, the political impact, and so on, of opportunities that needs to be drawn together. And if anything, a university is the place where you find that, and it's probably even more important that our universities own that zone.
Thanks, Tom. Brian?
Yeah, I have seen some very positive signs, but the external funding challenge is massive. I mean, if you look at since the recession, the funding for universities has just dropped and dropped and dropped. So unless there's funding coming from industry or from research that contributes to kind of economic activity, the others have been very challenged. Now, having said that, what I've seen, I mean, if some of the work the research centres do have a capacity to do co-creation with industry, with society, and with the policy system, and this is one of the luxuries or the freedoms that we've been provided with through the structures that are there. So, but if I look at one of the projects we did down in the Dingle Peninsula, this co-creation on sustainability, we've got a sociology and engineering working together with actors locally. But that type of transdisciplinary research needs to be valued in a higher way in universities. I mean, certainly, and I accept the points that have been made about impact recognizing things other than the traditional parameters. But to really accelerate this, that needs to come more to the fore, because that type of research requires a significant amount of time, engagement, and support. So it's really engaged and action research. And for it to flourish, it requires supports that aren't typically there. And the recognition then, some recognition, increased recognition for that. So while I have seen some positive examples and some of the reflections and the things that are coming through in the chat, the funding structure, the external environment within which we have to operate it really constrains those positive things that we're talking about, and valuing and measuring things other than the traditional metrics or the more recent kind of benefits to industry metrics. And we need this as if you look at climate and biodiversity, we have, it's not only that the planet is suffering, we have mandatory targets that we're not meeting. So even looking at it from the point of view of through an economic lens, we're going to be paying fines and trying to buy out from not meeting the targets that we have in place. So we really need, and if you look at the research funding as a whole, like we're bottom of the league table or close to that in the EU in terms of whether it's a proportion of GDP or a proportion of public expenditure. So that valuing of research needs to grow within the policies and the politics of how things are done. And then within that, we need more of the types of things we're talking about here. Collaboration with, I mean, you do see some examples like the recent IRC Coalesce call, where it was the lead is from arts, humanities, social science, and a required co-PI from STEM. We need, but I mean, it's a small sort of part of the research budget, but we need more of that kind of thing. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. I'll make a quick comment and then relay another question and then come to Olga, if that's okay. Yeah, I agree, and I think within universities, I'm going to put a little plug in for institutes as distinct from colleges and schools, and I think that they are a valuable part. So the colleges and schools tend to focus within disciplines, and I think the role of institutes is to get people thinking across disciplines and building bridges between colleges and schools. And I think they also have they can have the resource and the capacity to stimulate these kinds of debates and discussions. There's a few questions coming up around social enterprise, for example, and I think so we in the Earth Institute, one of our kind of cross-cutting dimensions relates to social enterprise because of the enthusiasm of some of the members for that. So I think there's great opportunity there to bring those kinds of ideas forward in an institute type structure. So the question that Funny enough, you've already answered Brian to some degree, which I'll also ask the other panelists to comment on after Olga's comment. So the question is, how can we get national and EU funders to further support more collaborative cross-trans interdisciplinary research so that the social and political context that underpin much of the thinking around climate and biodiversity crisis can be appropriately addressed? So that was one of the questions from the floor, and which chimes again with your comments about the Coalesce scheme, which I'm a big fan of, and which we promoted very strongly in the Institute as well. Olga, sorry.
No problem, thanks. Just a couple of points there. I suppose, you know, going back to the early noughties, I was a postdoc on an EU-funded project, which was about improving water use efficiency in horticulture. And I was in Scotland at the time, but there were also partners in Portugal and Turkey. And I remember that this project specifically required social scientists. So, you know, I was working very much from the plant biology side, but we were in Turkey doing some field work, and it was explained to us how farmers are paying for water per area, dependent on the area of land that they had, as opposed to the volume of water they used. So there was no incentive for them to reduce water use. So that was a kind of very clear you know, illustration that there is no point in doing all this scientific or technological work if it didn't get translated into changing the policy, so that would really have an impact. So that certainly was there at that time, that an understanding that there needed to be that social aspect and behavioural change and so on. Perhaps you know, perhaps it's been lost somewhere along the way since. But I would say that from a policy perspective, everything now is being looked at in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're always looking at the environmental, social and economic aspects, and this surely should be a very good way of encouraging an integration of disciplines to address all of those areas at once.
Absolutely, and I think we're lucky in Europe that, as you say, that European funding does tend to incorporate those different perspectives and disciplines to address challenges. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other thoughts around that funding landscape and how it potentially constrains us? Linda?
Just maybe just a quick personal comment. So one of the kind of most disruptive influences I have on my thinking is through the people I work with in creative arts practice. And you know, if you look around the world as well, if you look at kind of things like media archaeology, or if you look at, I don't know whether you've ever seen fantastic artwork called Anatomy of an AI System, and it's about what's behind the Amazon Echo by Vlad Joler and Kate Crawford. It's absolutely amazing, okay? But one of the things that constantly happens is that these people, and certainly my own creative arts people, never get paid what they're worth or as equals. And they're considered as to be tacked on to the end as, you know, you'll draw a nice picture, or you'll make this interesting in some other way. And I would say that my greatest understanding of power and inclusion and exclusion and things that are hugely important in biodiversity and climate change is driven by working with artists, actually. And until we move to a space, so the EU, yes, it does include in Horizon Europe opportunities, but nonetheless, I still think they're second-class citizens an awful lot when it comes to payment and stuff. And fundamentally, the greatest barrier is, I think Anna mentioned it, equality and kind of equal pay in the context of contributing to this. So for me, I think we need to absolutely keep pushing on that front, you know.
I agree. Anna.
Thanks, Linda. I absolutely agree. So I think until we reach a point where there is some sort of not some sort, where there is equality in terms of, you know, where there is discussion, where we agree, where we assume, where we take for granted that perhaps not, that we're working from different objectives and points of view, and we can debate them, but it means something, it will be very hard to get to a productive place. But I was thinking about, you know, policy making and who sets the objectives for policy making, etc. And I was thinking of the example that of the sharing economy. For a while, the European Union was pushing this notion of the shared economy and how great and wonderful it would be. things like Airbnb, etc. And what happened in my city, in Lisbon, is that the rental prices went up, like they doubled. People had to move away from cities. So setting policy goals, you know, the other example that I have is nanotechnology. The Americans started doing, everyone started doing it. And I'm not sure that's the best way to do it. So in a sense, what I would like us to do is that we have money for research, which we don't very much anymore, and different researchers would come up and be able to actually fund the things that they think are important. And obviously we will have a panel to evaluate us. But policy goals, I think, often end up missing the mark, or have unintended consequences. And so I really wish we could, I mean, and then obviously this is, you know, the European Union is all about accountability. And so the bureaucracy behind anything that you do with the EU is huge, etc. So there's all these different constraints that I understand, but still make it hard to actually do good research and produce valuable knowledge.
So just one last question. I'm sorry we won't have time to get through all of the great comments and questions in the chat, but I hope people have been able to take them on board as we've been going along. I just thought I'd pose a paraphrase of a question that's cropped up a few times. So in terms of what does the panel think higher education can do to help with the call for transformative change in terms of consumption, redistribution, and changing the structure of the economy, which global leaders and researchers have called for in recent years? So do you think universities should be doing more to really, as you say, kind of change the way we think at a more fundamental level? Does anyone have a thought on that, Anna? Yeah?
I'll go and just, I think I said it in my little speech. I teach. I tell my students about inequality. I give them examples from the tech world. I discuss, you know, the issue of race, the issue of minorities, the issue of the problems with meritocracy, for example. And I think I try to make better citizens. I'm not sure all of them get it. I'm sure not all of them get it. I'm sure not even half of them get it. But hopefully some of them will become better citizens. And that's really, as a professor, I think that's what I should do. Of course, you know, sometimes we have at my university, sometimes we have projects that involve the entire university, and we participate with NGOs, etc. And I think that's all great, part of the effort also.
That's pretty good. As a sorry, go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, when we look at it, it's been an interesting evolution in terms of the political ambitions for climate mitigation have grown and grown in many ways as we've done less and less. So the challenge becomes greater, and more recently, low consumption or changing consumption patterns has been something that's emerged. It's still the poor cousin in terms of the set of solutions that are generally looked at. And of course, this is one of the areas where it really requires the integration of kind of looking at the engineering, but with the politics and with the economics. And so this is one of the things we're kind of exploring in this deep institutional innovation project. And if you look at the last year, in some ways we've talked about COVID, but also we've seen a rise in populism. Also, we've seen a rise in racism and Black Lives Matter emerging. So there's been a whole series of things that have emerged, come to the surface, if you like. I mean, they were there, but they've come to the surface more and more. And so questioning some of these things, I mean, is very important, but in some respects, the pandemic has given us an opportunity to reflect, or a mandate to reflect, if you like, and to start thinking differently and looking differently at this thing. And of course, this then requires very much a multidisciplinary perspective. So that's one of the things that's emerged, I think, and within that context, looking at consumption, looking at inequality, looking at these things is now a requirement, whereas previously, well, it was always a requirement, but it was overlooked previously. But I think it's come to the fore now, which is positive.
Through the Sustainable Development Goals. Linda, yeah.
Maybe just to add two things. I think one thing we can do is we can stop treating any of these topics as something other and extra, but part of everything that you do teach. And you know, I mean, I think for me, it's about imparting understanding and helping people to act, not just the understanding. But you know, so while we need to, from a multidisciplinary perspective, work together on topics, I think there's the opposite, where part and parcel of every different discipline, there's an opportunity to embed this kind of thinking in it. That's the first thing. And the second thing, I mean, I know ourselves from a new course we're offering at undergraduate level, that it's like, on climate change, it's enormously oversubscribed. So there is an appetite for young people there who desperately want to be involved in this. So I think the universities can do more of that. I think they can do this in the context of lifelong learning as well, in the context of citizen science engagement. So I think there's many opportunities that we can kind of be a fora for the kind of debate and different perspectives that exist, as well as for education, as we're there for. So
thanks very much. Does anyone else want to make a final comment on that topic? Yeah.
Just to add that, you know, I tend to be surrounded by entrepreneurs who are, you don't find a pessimistic entrepreneur really. So it's quite interesting, Anna, to meet somebody who declares themselves as a pessimist. And I realized that I've been operating in a very controlled environment. And I think there's real value in having that more open discussion and connecting with people who have a very opposing opinion and a very opposing view. To reflect on that. So I think this has been a useful session for me. So thank you.
That's a nice note to end on, I think. And I think that's been quite a thread of this idea that the importance of multidisciplinary interactions and that disruptive thinking that comes from talking with people with completely different perspectives, and the opportunities that brings for new ideas and for research and innovation and impact. And so I'd like to thank you all very much indeed for a really stimulating discussion. I really enjoyed it. I'd like to also reiterate Dermot's thanks to the people that helped to organise the event, so particularly Jennifer Keneally, Dermot himself, Will Fitzmaurice and Katrina Debry from the Earth Institute. And I'd also like to thank everybody for participating and getting involved. There's a really nice set of comments and questions appearing in the chat. And just a reminder to finish with that this is the first of 3 seminars around higher education and building forwards better. There's one on higher education engagement with society on the 23rd of March, and that's going to include some consideration of the kind of institutional kind of best practice that we can bring to bear in relation to sustainability as well, which was flagged in one of the earlier talks, and also a session on teaching and learning on the 28th of April. So I do hope that you'll engage again with those conversations. So thanks very much, everybody.